The Iron Bank's heraldic banner, a pair of brazen scales balanced upon a midnight blue field, fluttered quietly in the harbor breeze. Ships bearing that same sigil lined the wharves of Bravos, hulls laden with chests of gold, bars of silver, and every manner of precious commodity. The harbor, immense and ancient, bustled with traders and mercenaries, sailors and diplomats alike, all converging on what was universally deemed the grandest financial institution in the known world. The Iron Bank's spires towered over the city's winding canals and bustling markets, each spire a silent vow. Debts would be paid, one way or another. It had always been thus. For centuries of recorded history, countless successions of kings and queens, princes and pretenders. Once the vaults of the Iron Bank opened to fund a throne, they expected returns, paid in gold or blood, if necessary. Across the straits, in the smoky, war-torn realm of the Westerlands, the Crown's legions were locked in a grinding conflict that had raged for the better part of a year. The conflict started as a border dispute, at least officially, yet everyone knew it was spurred on by old resentments, by the mutual scorn between King Kevin Baratheon and his once-trusted cousins, the House Valerion, whose young lord had laid claim to certain crown lands near the coastline. A few months of skirmishes turned into a series of pitched battles. Envoys came and went. Negotiations splintered. The king levied ever more troops to press his advantage. The knights of the realm rallied beneath the Golden Stag banner, while the rebellious lords under the Valerion Seahorse fought for every inch of contested ground. Through blood and steel, the war found its center, and gradually, the crown discovered it needed ever more coin to sustain the fight. The coffers in the royal capital were found wanting. The war expenses spiraled out of control, the cost of rations, the soldier salaries, the war horses, the siege equipment. In the first month, the crown turned to wealthy noble houses for loans. By the fourth, they approached lesser merchants. By the seventh, they had exhausted nearly every domestic resource that dared lend them a copper. And still the war dragged on, a hungry beast devouring silver faster than it could be minted. Almost inevitably, under the discreet counsel of the royal treasurer, the crown decided to extend a formal request to the Iron Bank. King Kevin himself penned a letter, sealed with the crown's golden signet, detailing the emergency measures needed to preserve the stability of the realm and defend the throne from incursion. In Bravos, the Iron Bank considered the request. They demanded terms, and King Kevin, cornered by necessity, conceded. He took on a sum that dwarfed all previous crown debts. The entire realm gasped at the enormity of it. The crown had never owed so much in its history. For months afterward, coin flowed. The war's momentum swung in favor of the king's armies. They outfitted new battalions, hired sellswords, and even contracted an infamous mercenary company from Essos to strike a decisive blow against the Valerion forces. Confidence grew in the royal capital. Poets sang about the unstoppable hand of the king, how the crown would eventually crush the rebellion. They sang so loud that they drowned out the faint, ominous rumors. The crown's debt to the Iron Bank remained unserviced, interest mounting by the week. The rumored sum was too staggering for any wise mind to ignore. One day soon, the bank would want repayment or a demonstration of good faith. But King Kevin, buoyed by his battlefield successes, paid those concerns no heed. The war demanded victory first, and that was the only matter occupying his mind. By the war's 10th month, the rebellious lords of Valerion discovered cunning allies among certain unscrupulous merchant fleets. Smugglers ran contraband weaponry, morale soared in the rebel camps, and the crown's lines started to falter. King Kevin's generals clamored for reinforcements, for fresh supplies of coin to pay the foreign mercenaries, and for all manner of logistical support. Hounded by these demands, the king looked at his royal treasurer's ledgers and found a terrifying truth. The realm was effectively broke. The meager revenues trickling in from taxes could not pay even the interest on the crown's massive loan, let alone keep up with new war expenditures. The Iron Bank had already issued multiple warnings. The crown had defaulted on payments 3 times. More ominously, Bravos had begun to impose quiet sanctions on ships bearing the royal crest. The king seethed. He ordered more letters penned to the Iron Bank, requesting patience, promising that once the war ended, the crown's spoils would enrich everyone. A final letter arrived from Braavos in response, written in a hand both elegant and chillingly firm. The bank had heard enough promises. Braavos demanded immediate partial repayment or a credible show of the crown's capacity to repay the sum in the near future. The Iron Bank's envoys delivered the letter and departed with grave courtesy, leaving behind a subtle sense that time was running out. The king felt the walls closing in around him. His ministers spoke in hushed tones about how ill it boded to break faith with the Iron Bank. The realm's history was replete with cautionary tales of kings who fell out of favor with Braavos. A fortnight later, the crown's war effort stalled. Supplies ran short. Sellswords deserted in droves, drawn away by the absence of pay or by richer offers from the rebels. The crown's only recourse was to send a final desperate request to Braavos for more gold, or at least a delay in repayment. The Iron Bank's response arrived in the capital with the next tide. A sealed missive addressed not to the king, but to the Lord Treasurer. Within a single unambiguous statement, the crown was in default. The Iron Bank's support was rescinded. The vaults of Braavos would open to a new claimant, someone who might actually make good on the kingdom's debts. Word spread through the realm like wildfire. The Iron Bank was done with King Kevin. They were foreclosing on the throne itself, effectively seizing many of the crown's overseas assets and appointing a rival. For in Braavos, there had arrived a cunning nobleman claiming a rightful line of succession to the throne. This nobleman, Lord Bartimaeus Lannister, carried genealogical documents that traced his bloodline in a way that threatened King Kevin's legitimacy. Bartimaeus had offered the Iron Bank full repayment of the crown's debt if he took the throne. And so the Iron Bank, with all its financial might, decided to back him. That was the spark that ignited a new phase in the war. King Kevin learned that the Iron Bank had purchased entire ships' worth of provisions, arms, and soldiers from Essos for Bartimaeus. He also learned the rebellious lords of Valerion had grown close to Bartimaeus, forging an alliance that might tilt the balance permanently against the king. The formidable brazen scales hovered over the entire conflict, and those scales were now weighed in favor of the rival claimant. When the news reached the capital, King Kevin lashed out in fury at his small council, at his generals, at the entire realm. Nobody had foreseen that the Iron Bank might so decisively switch sides mid-war, turning the crown's own debts into a weapon of dethronement. This was unprecedented. No one had dared to imagine that the mighty crown might be undone by the very institution that had once funded it. Late one evening, in the flickering candlelight of the royal war room, King Kevin presided over a final, desperate meeting with his remaining loyalists. The war maps showed front lines collapsing on every side. The roads in and out of the capital were fraught with rebels and mercenaries. Rumors held that Lord Bartimaeus, the bank's golden-haired champion, had landed on the western coast with a small but impeccably equipped army. Those present in the war council trembled, for they all knew it was over. Without coin, soldiers were worthless. Without supplies, the kingdom's farmlands would be pillaged. The crown's might was rotting from within. That very night, in a private chamber high above the courtyard, King Kevin pored over the Iron Bank's final notice with the royal treasurer at his side. Braavos was giving him one last chance, an impossible demand: repay a certain sum within a week, or the Iron Bank would publicly renounce his house's legitimacy to foreign courts and declare open support for Bartimaeus. Kevin's face was ashen, his broad shoulders slumped. He had no illusions about what such a move would mean. A realm cannot stand if the world's wealthiest bank proclaims it bankrupt and illegitimate. The next day, Kevin's outriders spotted the first banners of Bartimaeus's force approaching from the coastline. Word spread that Braavos had funded a fearsome company of mounted knights, along with siege engineers. They marched in perfect formation, a sight seldom seen outside the free cities. At dawn, King Kevin's loyal courtiers stood on the city walls, gazing out. In the far distance, a horizon of dust marked the approach of an army, and not merely Bartimaeus's forces. Valerion banners, along with those of other disaffected lords, joined them. King Kevin's stranglehold on the kingdom had never looked so frail. From a purely economic standpoint, the city was shattered. The final reserves of the royal treasury had been used to sustain the capital's defenses. But with so many mercenaries gone, and with no gold left to hire fresh ones, the city's gates were guarded mostly by a ragtag militia and remnants of once glorious knights. The king, still resolute in his pride, refused to surrender. He sent a messenger under a white flag to greet Bartimaeus's field tent, hoping to negotiate. The messenger returned under heavy guard with a simple statement. Bartimaeus would negotiate only if the king abdicated and recognized Bartimaeus as the rightful heir. "You shall be allowed to keep your life and a small domain," the letter said, "but the throne and the realm must be delivered into my hands. The Iron Bank has seen to the rest." Furious, Kevin tore the letter to shreds. Still, he knew the essence of it was true. Without gold, he had no chance. The realm's lords were deserting in droves, lured by the promise of prompt payment or threatened by the specter of Bravos's wrath. And so, in desperation, Kevin turned to an idea that was whispered by one of his more pragmatic advisors. The crown would forcibly seize the assets of a few wealthy merchant houses in the capital, melt down whatever gold or silver they had, and send that as partial payment to the Iron Bank, hoping to buy time. The plan was quickly put into action. In a single night, the crown's men-at-arms ransacked the vaults of the largest guild houses within the city. Merchants screamed for justice, but no one was listening. It was a grave miscalculation. The city erupted in chaos, with riots breaking out in the street. Meanwhile, the meager silver gleaned from that plunder was nowhere near enough to appease the Iron Bank. News of the panic in the capital spread faster than a plague. Bartimaeus's army seized upon the city's turmoil. In the chaotic nights that followed, the rebels and the Bravosi-backed forces advanced inexorably toward the walls. All that gold fueling Bartimaeus's war machine had purchased the loyalty of skilled engineers, their siege engines rolling in. They raised trebuchets, catapults, and ballistae so tall they rivaled the city's ramparts. The rumble of approaching war was tangible in the capital's alleyways. 2 days later, the Iron Bank's emissaries arrived at Bartimaeus's war camp just outside the city gates. This time, their presence was jubilant, a sign of the swift synergy between money and power. They were said to have brought new dispatches from Bravos with additional lines of credit. The rumor was that Bartimaeus had promised the Bravosi free rein to establish a permanent outpost in the capital once he took the throne, along with an arrangement to repay every copper the old crown owed within 5 years. It was an unthinkably large sum, but with the kingdom's entire tax base at his disposal, and the possibility of further conquests, Bartimaeus made an appealing proposition. And so the Bravosi bankers and their formidable sellsword attaches prepared to watch the siege. It was not their duty to fight for Bartimaeus, but they stood at the ready, ensuring no last-minute trickery would strip them of their rightful repayment. As the siege began, Bartimaeus erected his command pavilion on a gentle rise of ground overlooking the city's southwestern gate. He was a tall man in his middle years, bearing the same golden hair that had for centuries marked the Lannister bloodline. He wore polished armor etched with his crest, a golden lion's head superimposed upon a silver coin, his personal symbol, newly minted for this campaign. In his presence, one felt a careful mixture of calculated charm and cold opportunism. He addressed his gathered knights, mercenaries, and rebel allies with the confident assurance of a man whose every gesture was backed by inexhaustible gold. That night, the gloom over the capital was thick. Fires glowed along the walls. The defenders readied what meager catapults they possessed, and the battered crown loyalists waited in dread. A hush fell over the battlefield as Bartimaeus's forces began the siege in earnest. The first boulders and flaming projectiles soared over the walls at sunrise, crashing into the city's higher parapets. It was a grim day, marked by the clang of steel, the crackle of flames, and the screams of the wounded. King Kevin led from within the city, determined to inspire what remained of his loyal knights. But each day that passed, desertions increased, the people starved, and the battered defenders lost hope. No relief force marched to save them. No new shipments of gold arrived. Bravos's coffer had closed. The king was alone. By the second week of the siege, the southwestern wall began to crumble under the merciless pounding of Bartimaeus's trebuchets. Dust and rubble rained down, and the city's morale shattered further. It was on the 17th day of the siege that the southwestern wall collapsed entirely in a thunderous roar. An entire section of rampart gave way, leaving a gaping breach wide enough to drive 5 wagons abreast. King Kevin mustered his last reserve of knights and foot soldiers behind the rubble, determined to mount a desperate defense. For a moment, as Bartimaeus's forces surged forward, a furious melee ensued. The crown's knights fought with mad courage, knowing the alternative was surrender. They succeeded in stalling the attackers just long enough for more city militia to arrive. The fight was brutal and close quarters, with swords hacking and men screaming. But none could deny the superior discipline and equipment of Bartimaeus's men. Each soldier's arms and armor were newly forged, paid for in Bravosi gold. Each foot soldier's morale was bolstered by the promise of ample spoils. The defenders held that breach for half a day, then fell back under relentless pressure. By dusk, Bartimaeus's banners were planted firmly inside the city walls. Chaos erupted in the streets. Some pockets of militia valiantly resisted, erecting barricades and attempting to funnel the enemy into narrow alleys. But the weight of numbers, the unstoppable tide of professional troops, carried everything before them. Plumes of smoke rose from the capital's old quarter as fires broke out. By nightfall, half the city was in Bartimaeus's control. The Iron Bank's envoys were said to be following at a short distance, not interfering, merely observing the reclamation of their investment. In the royal keep, King Kevin realized the inevitable. He had lost. His supporters frantically discussed possible escape routes or final stands. The keep was well fortified, but with no hope of reinforcements, it was only a matter of time before Bartimaeus's forces breached the thick walls. Kevin stood in the great hall, watching as refugees and courtiers panicked. A hush fell when a wounded knight limped in, reporting that Bartimaeus's men had smashed the keep's outer gates and were preparing the battering rams for the last assault. Kevin, still defiant, ordered the gates reinforced and prepared his personal guard for a final stand. To those nearest him, he muttered that he would not die cowering in some corner. The final assault came at dawn. The rams slammed against the iron-banded doors of the keep with steady, punishing rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact reverberated in the corridors. The defenders braced the doors, poured boiling oil through murder holes, and rained arrows down on the assaulting soldiers. But they were too few. The gate eventually splintered, and Bartimaeus's knights poured in. Gleaming steel crashed against battered armor. The defenders fought with the desperation of cornered wolves, but the outcome was clear. When the main hall was overrun, Kevin and his personal guard made their last stand on the dais, the same dais from which the king had once dispensed justice. Now it was a desperate fortress of overturned tables and fallen banners. The final clash was brief. Bartimaeus's men quickly overpowered the defenders. Kevin himself was wounded, his sword knocked from his hand. 2 knights pinned him to the floor while he raged at them to show themselves as men. The chaos subsided. Bartimaeus entered the hall at a measured pace, wearing a battered but still resplendent suit of armor, the gold of his lion's crest tarnished by smoke and dust. He stared down at Kevin. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackling of distant flames and the moans of the dying. Then Bartimaeus spoke quietly. "Your debt has come due. You have nothing left to pay, your grace." He emphasized the last words with quiet irony. Kevin spat blood, cursing him, cursing the Iron Bank for its betrayal. But no one answered his accusations. In one fluid gesture, Bartimaeus gave the order. The dethroned king was to be seized and placed under guard. There would be no mercy. Kevin might live, or he might hang, depending on Bartimaeus's final decision. Outside, the city reeled under new authority. The lion coin banner was raised above the keep's tallest tower, trumpets blaring a triumphant melody. The crown, an object of hammered gold, set with precious stones, was found inside the royal treasury's hidden vault. When it was placed in Bartimaeus's hands, he lifted it, studying the dazzling gems in the flickering torchlight. Wordlessly, he set it upon his own head. His supporters cheered. The very next day, the Iron Bank's emissaries were granted an audience with the newly crowned King Bartimaeus. In the keep's throne room, they presented him with official documents, sealed with the Bravosi sigil, affirming that the bank recognized his reign as the legitimate monarchy of the realm. As part of the arrangement, Bartimaeus publicly proclaimed that the crown's outstanding debt to Bravos would be honored in full, now secured by the new regime's resources and the spoils gleaned from rebellious lords who had opposed him. Meanwhile, the city's population looked on with a mixture of relief and dismay. The war seemed to be ending. Blood had been spilled, but the unstoppable logic of coin had decided the outcome. Over the following weeks, Bartimaeus consolidated his power. He organized the distribution of bread and wine to the starving populace, seeking to ease the worst of the war's misery. The masses, for their part, thanked any god that would listen for an end to the bloodshed. Soldiers patrolled the streets, collecting any hidden arms and dequashing any riots that flared. Publicly, Bartimaeus spoke of unity, urging the kingdom to come together under his rule. But he knew well that not everyone would accept him overnight. The realm was scarred. Noble houses that had once pledged loyalty to Kevin might resist or cause trouble. Some might attempt to rise again if given the chance. Yet, with the Iron Bank firmly behind him, Bartimaeus had a far-reaching advantage. He set about rewarding his faithful backers. Lands were granted to the knights who had supported him. Offices and titles were given to Bravosi associates. A new wave of commerce began to flow from Bravos, revitalizing the battered capital. Trade ships lined the docks. Caravans from across the sea arrived with goods. The city began to heal, ironically thanks to the gold that had toppled the old king. Meanwhile, Kevin was kept in the dungeons deep beneath the keep, heavily guarded. His one request was to be allowed a priest for confession, which Bartimaeus permitted, if only to keep up appearances of mercy. There were rumors that Kevin plotted an escape or that he had secretly ordered the hidden gold reserves to be spirited out of the city before it fell. Bartimaeus spared him for the moment, uncertain whether executing him might provoke further instability. Should Kevin remain alive in the event that Bartimaeus's new government needed a figurehead for negotiations? Or was it safer to simply be rid of him? The newly crowned king weighed these considerations with the cool detachment of a man who had played every angle to gain the throne in the first place. Far away, in Bravos, the governors of the Iron Bank presided over the transaction records with quiet satisfaction. By displacing an indebted king and installing one who could pay, they had not only protected their interests, but potentially secured a more lucrative arrangement with the kingdom. The old precedent that the bank always gets its due had been reinforced. Tales of the crown's foreclosure spread across continents, whispered in taverns and courts alike. Rulers abroad trembled, reminding themselves that no matter how large one's army, it was gold that greased the wheels of war. And if the Iron Bank decided one day to withdraw their support, even the mightiest throne could crumble. As the first months of Bartimaeus's reign passed, he found that wearing the crown carried unexpected burdens. Even though he had united the rebellious lords under his claim, vestiges of the old regime lingered. Some holdfasts refused to bend the knee, crying out that Bartimaeus was a usurper, a puppet of the Bravosi bankers. Others, especially in the eastern provinces, still revered King Kevin's lineage. They had not yet felt the direct sting of the war, and their local lords had grown complacent, ignoring Bartimaeus's demands that they send taxes to the capital. Bartimaeus, a prudent man, decided that he would not immediately wage a new war to subdue these malcontents. Instead, he deployed the same weapon that had already proven so effective: gold. He extended loans, bribes, and favorable trade deals to certain key houses, ensuring that they would turn on their neighbors if it served their financial interests. Coin, once again, was mightier than the sword. Still, suspicion dogged him. Many in the realm whispered behind closed doors that the new king was nothing more than a steward for the Iron Bank, that Bravos was the true master behind the throne. Even some of Bartimaeus's trusted allies questioned the extent of the bank's power. The new king was certain to repay his loans to Bravos promptly, but at what cost to the kingdom's autonomy? For every shipment of gold that Bartimaeus sent back to the free city, he had to extract a corresponding tax from his people. Over time, these taxes could become onerous. The Iron Bank, unrelenting in its procedures, demanded steady interest payments, ensuring that if Bartimaeus defaulted, the entire process would repeat itself. A king installed by the bank could be deposed by the bank just as swiftly, should they decide he was no longer an asset. Bartimaeus, though cunning and ambitious, was not without a sense of caution. He knew he walked a narrow line. To fortify his rule, he needed to keep the bankers happy but also ensure the realm did not break under oppressive taxation. He adopted a moderate approach. Certain large sums went north, to the houses that had been wounded by the war, hoping to heal old grievances. He invited them to the capital to negotiate new trade routes, using Braavosi connections to make them wealthy if they pledged fealty. In the southwestern region, near the coast where Valerian influence was strongest, Bartimaeus enforced strict controls, placing new garrisons and collecting taxes ruthlessly. He had not forgotten that House Valerian had sparked the war originally, and even though they had partially aligned with him at the end, their loyalty was far from absolute. A new claimant might arise among them if the situation was right. All the while, the capital itself was slowly rebuilt. Streets cleared of rubble, new structures erected, the markets revived, spurred by Braavosi merchant fleets. On the surface, it seemed that Bartimaeus's rule was providing a new era of stability and prosperity. Minstrels and bards in taverns tentatively began to compose songs about the Lion King who brought gold. Yet behind the scenes, the Iron Bank's presence was palpably felt. Their agents resided in a handsome building near the main square, a building that had once been used by the Crown's treasury officials. It was now retooled into a formal Braavosi consulate. Every local merchant dealing in large sums had to register with Braavosi clerks, and certain city officials took direct orders from Bravos. Although Bartimaeus publicly denied it, many suspected that the kingdom's own financial bureaucracy was overshadowed by the Iron Bank's watchers. One of Bartimaeus's greatest challenges came in the form of rebellious conspiracies that took shape in the kingdom's heartland. Tales of King Kevin's captivity spurred fervent monarchists who viewed Bartimaeus as a traitor to the realm's ancient traditions. A clandestine group of knights and priests began plotting to free Kevin. They gathered in secret chapels and remote countryside estates, forging alliances. They reasoned that if they could break Kevin out of the capital's dungeons, they might rally enough nobles to ignite a fresh uprising. Surely, the realm would rally behind the rightful king if only he were free. Yet these conspirators lacked a crucial element: money. They possessed zeal and loyalty, but no significant coffers. The war had drained them, and no wealthy benefactor dared oppose Bartimaeus openly. The conspirators scrounged for coin, they borrowed from sympathetic local lords, but it was a pittance compared to the sums that Bartimaeus commanded. Without a serious influx of funds, they could not hope to hire mercenaries or buy the loyalty of enough soldiers to overthrow the capital's garrison. In the midst of this simmering discontent, Bartimaeus decided to hold a grand feast to commemorate the 6-month anniversary of his coronation. He hoped the pageantry would help legitimize his reign and display his prosperity to the realm's nobility. Lavish invitations went out, accompanied by offers of accommodation and security. Bartimaeus's knights personally escorted certain reluctant lords to the festivities, ensuring they would attend. The feast took place in the refurbished Grand Hall, now draped with banners of the Lion Coin sigil. Musicians played from a dais, while banquets of roasted boar, venison, and exotic fruits delighted the guests. The Iron Bank's chief emissary was present, a slender man named Rodrigo, clad in dignified black attire. He watched everything with keen, watchful eyes. As the feast wore on, Bartimaeus mingled among the nobles, exuding confidence. He toasted to unity, to a prosperous realm, to the blessings of the gods. Yet behind the scenes, he worked discreetly to ensure potential threats were managed. Loyal spymasters circulated among the guests, listening to murmurs, collecting rumors. If any rebellious house dared speak openly of Kevin, they would be identified swiftly. Bartimaeus planned to strike first if he detected a plot. He had no intention of letting an internal revolt catch him by surprise. At the height of the celebration, Bartimaeus took the dais and lifted his chalice. The hall fell silent. He spoke with crisp, measured authority. He declared that the horrors of war were behind them, that the realm was on a path to renewed greatness. He announced forthcoming alliances with bravos that would bring commerce and wealth to all corners of the kingdom. Applause rang out, albeit some was forced. Rodrigo, the bank's emissary, gave a courteous nod as Bartimaeus acknowledged Bravos's crucial role. Yet, unspoken by all but understood by many, was the fact that with each new bond forged with the Iron Bank, the crown's independence waned just a bit more. After the feast, once the torches had burned low, Bartimaeus retired to his private chambers. He was half tempted to celebrate alone, but caution overcame that impulse. Instead, he summoned a few of his most trusted counselors. His master of coin, his master of whispers, and the newly appointed Lord Commander of the King's Guard. They discussed the latest intelligence from the countryside. Whispers of insurgent pockets, talk of Kevin's possible rescue. Bartimaeus frowned. The cost of a sweeping crackdown might be considerable, and he did not want to alienate too many lords at once. Better to use a scalpel than a hammer. The Master of Whispers suggested infiltration, bribery, a series of well-placed arrests. Bartimaeus nodded. Coin had won him the throne. It would keep him there. In the weeks that followed, Bartimaeus's network of spies quietly rooted out several ringleaders of the monarchy restoration plot. Dozens of lesser knights were taken into custody, their lands seized, their arms confiscated. A hush fell over the conspirators. Those still free scattered, hiding in remote strongholds, waiting for a better chance. Meanwhile, Kevin languished in the dungeons, left to brood in darkness. He was not physically tortured, for Bartimaeus saw no need. Yet the psychological torment of knowing he had lost everything was acute. Occasionally, a jailer brought him fresh clothing or decent food, a gesture that hinted Bartimaeus might be preserving him for a future role. But as the days stretched on, Kevin's rage slowly gave way to despair. His knights had fallen, his lineage disgraced, and the people began to accept Bartimaeus as their king. The one glimmer of hope was that fortune could be fickle. If the Iron Bank had switched sides once, perhaps it might switch again. If Bartimaeus found himself unable to keep up the debt repayments, if he committed some grave mistake and defaulted, then the Bravosi might seek a new champion. That was the crux of power in this new era. The throne's occupant would be determined by who could best satisfy the bank's merciless demands. Kevin considered ways to exploit this. Could he amass gold from some hidden source? Could he strike a secret deal with an enemy of Bravos? But from within his cell, with no allies, it seemed an impossible dream. Guards stationed outside took no bribes. Their loyalty was purchased with Bartimaeus's gold. The cyclical power of money kept Kevin pinned in chains. As for the Iron Bank, it continued to watch the realm's developments from its vantage in Bravos. Letters arrived weekly, carried by swift ships, detailing tax receipts, trade expansions, and the crown's incremental repayments. So far, Bartimaeus was making good on his obligations. The coffers in Bravos swelled with the returning interest. The bank's directors raised no objection to Bartimaeus's rule, for it served them well. Yet behind the bank's austere facade, some among the Bravosi might have begun to wonder, was Bartimaeus a permanent solution? Kings rarely lasted forever, and if a chance for greater profit emerged from a different quarter, the Iron Bank would not hesitate to change course. For now, though, Bartimaeus was the best option. A year passed. The realm stabilized. Crops were planted. Trade routes hummed with activity, and the general populace enjoyed a lull from the horrors of war. Skepticism about Bartimaeus remained, but many admitted he had brought a semblance of peace, if not freedom from heavy taxation. The new king took steps to demonstrate his generosity, establishing markets, repairing roads, hosting festivals. He publicly declared that the realm was once again open to foreigners. Embassies arrived from distant lands, some seeking alliances, others merely curious about the monarchy propped up by the Iron Bank. The common folk, exhausted by war, found a measure of relief and were content enough to let matters lie. Meanwhile, in the labyrinthine corridors of the keep, Bartimaeus's reign slowly took on a veneer of legitimacy. He minted new coins bearing his likeness, wearing the crown that once belonged to Kevin. The coins circulated throughout the kingdom. There was an almost surreal feeling among some of the older knights and courtiers. The monarchy had changed hands, yet life went on. The lines on the map remained the same, the taxes still collected, but the occupant of the throne was different. Such was the power of wealth to shape the realm's destiny. Some wondered if Bartimaeus would eventually produce an heir or marry strategically to cement alliances. Others cynically suggested that the Iron Bank was the real bride in this arrangement, and the king's only duty was to keep the bank's bed warm with gold. Kevin watched these developments from behind bars, hearing snatches of gossip from passing guards. He learned that Bartimaeus had begun traveling to outlying regions, receiving the homage of reluctant lords. The realm was quiet. That quietness, however, weighed on Kevin's spirit. It was the quietness of acceptance, the slow forgetting of his own claim to the throne. In a twisted sense, it was also the quietness that signified the Iron Bank had been fully repaid, or nearly so. Indeed, Bartimaeus used every avenue to funnel wealth back to Braavos, fulfilling his promise. On one auspicious day, a Braavosi emissary announced that the crown's principal debt was almost cleared, and only a fraction of the final sum remained. That same day, Bartimaeus held court in the throne room, wearing a rare smile, to toast the near completion of the repayment. The Iron Bank was pleased. The kingdom's trade flourished. The new king was secure. Yet ironically, it was on that day when Bartimaeus stood at his pinnacle of triumph that the seeds of doubt germinated within the Iron Bank. Having nearly recouped their investment with interest, they began to look ahead, as bankers often do. Could a more profitable arrangement be made with a different claimant? The realm was healing, which meant it was ripe for future exploitation. If Bartimaeus soon paid off his debt, then what ongoing leverage did Braavos possess? Indeed, a free and financially unencumbered monarch might eventually resent the foreign bankers who had put him on the throne. He might even try to reduce Braavosi influence in the kingdom. A small group within the bank's leadership quietly weighed the risks. They recalled how Kevin had once proven troublesome, but the process had led the bank to engineer a successful coup, placing Bartimaeus in power. Such a strategy could be repeated if needed. Meanwhile, rumors reached Braavos that in the kingdom's eastern marches, a charismatic princess of the old royal line was raising quiet support. Another potential contender with an arguably better claim than Bartimaeus. The bank took note. Bartimaeus, not blind to these realities, had become warier with each passing month. He understood the Iron Bank might turn on him if it suited their bottom line. He cultivated personal alliances among the Braavosi, bribing or charming the more influential bankers in hopes of securing their personal loyalty. He also tightened his own treasury's surveillance of Braavosi transactions in the kingdom. The relationship between the monarchy and the bank, once so unified, was beginning to show hairline fractures. A monarchy that was no longer in debt was a monarchy that could choose its own path. And the bank, if threatened, might consider backing someone else to reimpose their ironclad financial grip. The turning point came late one autumn, when a Braavosi trade delegation arrived at the capital, accompanied by a minor but regal figure, Princess Elora, a distant cousin to Kevin, whom many believed had a legitimate dynastic claim. Tall, dark-haired, with a refined air of quiet determination, she was rumored to be a skilled negotiator. She had spent years in voluntary exile, watching from afar as Kevin lost the throne. Now she returned as a guest of the Braavosi, claiming she wished only to sign trade agreements. Bartimaeus, though cautious, allowed her into the city, hoping to maintain the veneer of civility. Publicly, he treated her as an esteemed relative, offering her royal accommodations in the keep. But behind closed doors, Bartimaeus bristled with paranoia. Why was she here? What were the Braavosi plotting? In truth, the Iron Bank had extended an invitation to Elora without fully revealing their intent. They wanted to see if she might be a more compliant ally than Bartimaeus, should the time come to replace him. A discreet meeting took place late at night in a hall near the Bravosi consulate. Alora sat across from the bank's envoys, answering polite yet probing questions about her ambitions for the throne, her willingness to settle debts, and her potential for forging new trade routes. She responded carefully, not pledging anything outright, yet leaving enough hints that if Bartimaeus faltered or turned against Bravos, she would be open to a new arrangement. As the autumn winds grew colder, the capital buzzed with speculation about Alora's presence. Bartimaeus's spies reported everything back to him. Realizing the threat, Bartimaeus summoned his top advisors. He raged about the Iron Bank's gall, bringing a rival claimant directly into his capital. Some advisors suggested arresting her, but Bartimaeus recognized the risk of openly opposing the bank. He debated sending subtle assassins, but that might provoke open hostilities with Bravos. For all his cunning, Bartimaeus was cornered by the same dynamic that once ensnared King Kevin, the unstoppable might of Bravosi coin. In the end, he greeted Alora with forced courtesy whenever they crossed paths in the keep, while anxiously scanning for any sign that the Bravosi had already chosen her as his replacement. The city's tension escalated when Alora began convening with local nobles, inviting them to informal dinners in the lavish suite the Bravosi had secured for her. Some accepted out of curiosity, others because they silently despised Bartimaeus, resenting the heavy taxes that funded his Bravosi debt repayments. Over fine wine, Alora quietly assured them that, if she were ever to take the throne, she would govern more lightly, reduce taxes, and restore the old traditions that Bartimaeus had swept aside. The more she spoke, the more she gained a small but devoted following among those who had grown tired of Bartimaeus's golden tyranny. Rumors soon reached Kevin in the dungeon. A handful of sympathetic guards still held some loyalty to the Baratheon line. Kevin latched onto the news that Princess Alora was in the capital. Although she was not his daughter, she was linked to him by blood and might hold the key to toppling Bartimaeus. Yet Kevin felt only by Turnus that the Iron Bank might pass him over again in favor of a new pawn. The brand of irrelevance stung him. He began to compose letters in his mind, hypothetical alliances, strategies. But locked behind bars, with no direct means of communication, he was powerless. The only question was whether the bank, in its cunning, saw any reason to restore Kevin himself, or if they would prefer a fresh face like Alora. Then came the moment that set events into motion. Bartimaeus unexpectedly informed the Iron Bank that his final repayment installment would be delayed. His treasury officials had encountered a sudden shortage, brought on by poor harvests and insufficient tax collection from rebellious border regions. He requested an extension of a few months. This in itself was not shocking. Bartimaeus had occasionally asked for short deferrals before and had always made good on them eventually. But this time, the bank's response was frosty. The note that arrived from Bravos demanded an immediate explanation. The bank politely but pointedly reminded Bartimaeus of the precarious situation that had led to Kevin's downfall. A new king was made. A new king could be unmade. The message was subtle but menacing. Bartimaeus read it in silence, anger smoldering in his eyes. He grasped the bank's meaning. They could use Alora as a replacement, just as they had once used him. Provoked, Bartimaeus decided to risk a bold move. He sent an ultimatum back to Bravos. If they did not grant him leniency in repaying the debt, he would reconsider the privileges and assets that the Iron Bank held in the capital. In other words, he threatened to confiscate their consulate or restrict their trade. It was a desperate gamble. He was effectively attempting to stand up to the bank. Some of his advisors begged him to reconsider, for the bank's might was boundless. But Bartimaeus, fearful of losing the throne to Alora, concluded that he could not keep bowing to Bravosi dictates forever. He had nearly paid back the full debt. How could the bank possibly justify deposing him for a minor delay? In Bravos, the bank's governors met in closed session to consider Bartimaeus's ultimatum. There was uproar among the more traditional voices. A king threatening the Iron Bank? Unthinkable. Others, the more pragmatic or cunning among them, saw an opportunity. If Bartimaeus had become too bold, perhaps it was time to place their bets on a new claimant, Princess Alora. The final portion of Bartimaeus's debt was comparatively small, so losing it might be acceptable if it meant installing a fresh monarch who would once again be completely indebted to them. Indeed, if they pushed Elora into the throne, she would likely require a massive loan to quell the ensuing chaos, thus ensuring a new cycle of dependency. The bank, after all, thrived on these cycles. Word eventually reached Elora that the bank was considering her. She tensed at the idea of plunging the realm into fresh conflict. Could there be a more elegant solution? She and her closest advisors debated. If Bartimaeus was indeed antagonizing the bank, he might be vulnerable. But launching another war for the throne so soon would devastate the realm. She sent discreet messages to certain lords, gauging their support if she formally challenged Bartimaeus. The responses varied, but enough were positive to embolden her. The bank, for its part, quietly mustered resources in Essos, preparing a contingency plan. Mercenary companies, the same or similar to those that had helped Bartimaeus, might again make the crossing, this time under Elora's banner. The irony was thick, but such was the bank's modus operandi. Within the capital, Bartimaeus sensed the tide turning against him. The Braavosi consulate closed its doors to the king's envoys. A cadre of armed mercenaries, wearing Braavosi colors, appeared at the consulate gates. Bartimaeus responded by tightening security around the keep, stationing his personal guard at strategic points. Tensions escalated. Ambassadors from other realms took note of the looming confrontation. Whispers of a possible new civil war floated through the taverns like acrid smoke. Princess Elora, now in a precarious position, recognized that the Iron Bank was waiting for a spark, some irreparable break between Bartimaeus and Braavos that would justify them in shifting their support openly. She had no desire for a protracted siege that would ravage the city. Instead, she reached out to a handful of key nobles inside the capital, orchestrating a plan to oust Bartimaeus quickly. The idea: secure the keep in one swift move, arrest or depose Bartimaeus, and declare Elora queen under the protection of the Braavosi. If it worked, bloodshed might be minimal. If it failed, she would almost certainly be executed as a traitor. On a cold winter night, with snow drifting through the city's narrow lanes, Elora's conspirators made their move. A group of high-born knights aligned with her escorted her to the keep's side entrance, a post manned by a guard captain who had been secretly bribed. The guards stood aside, letting them pass into the keep's lower corridors. A contingent of about 50 men, well-armed, all hand-picked from sympathetic houses, accompanied her. At the same time, a Braavosi detachment discreetly left the consulate, heading toward the keep from another direction, ensuring that if Bartimaeus's loyalists responded, they would face a two-pronged assault. Inside the keep, only a portion of the royal guard was on duty, unaware of the incursion until it was too late. Within minutes, the conspirators seized the armory, the stables, and several key junctions leading to the royal apartments. Alarm bells began to toll, but confusion reigned. Many of Bartimaeus's men had grown complacent, certain that no one would dare launch a coup so soon after the last war. Meanwhile, Elora's knights secured passage for her deeper into the keep, driving off small pockets of resistance. The noise of battle echoed through the corridors. Some loyal guards fought fiercely but were overrun by sheer surprise and numbers. A loud crash reverberated as the conspirators forced open a reinforced door leading to the main courtyard. Bartimaeus, roused from bed by shouts, threw on his armor and gathered what guards he could find. He roared at them to defend the throne. Confusion surrounded him. He did not immediately know who was attacking or why. Then a wounded guard stumbled in, gasping that Princess Elora was at the gates, leading knights under the Braavosi banner. Betrayal hammered at Bartimaeus's mind. He cursed the Iron Bank aloud, bellowing that they would not take his kingdom from him. Sword in hand, he stormed toward the throne room, intending to rally a defense. Unfortunately for him, Elora's men had already seized a strategic corridor. A fierce clash erupted as Bartimaeus's small band encountered the conspirators. Steel rang on steel. Bartimaeus, though a capable fighter, was overwhelmed. Some of his guard fell. Others surrendered. Elora herself arrived, flanked by her knights, her face grim. She demanded Bartimaeus lay down his sword. He refused, swinging viciously at the men who pressed him. The fight continued until one of Elora's knights managed to knock Bartimaeus's blade aside, and another pinned him to the floor. Bartimaeus, chest heaving, glowered at the princess with fury. She commanded that he be bound in chains. In the distance, the old alarm bells still tolled, but the keep was effectively secured. Braavosi soldiers arrived soon after, ensuring that any pockets of resistance would be quashed. The city's populace woke in the night, frightened to see armed Braavosi patrols again, but no large-scale battle ensued. The swift coup had succeeded. By dawn, Princess Elora stood in the throne room, ringed by conspirators and Braavosi envoys. Amid the hush, she settled herself upon the throne once occupied by Kevin, and more recently by Bartimaeus. The Iron Bank's herald was there, reading from an official decree that recognized her as the rightful queen, citing her lineage. Although the populace had grown weary of such abrupt changes, the presence of Braavosi steel silenced any protest. A day later, Elora visited Kevin's cell in secret. She found him gaunt, disheveled, his eyes full of hollow resentment. There was no joyous reunion. She told him bluntly that she was now queen, recognized by the bank, and that she would permit him to live in comfortable confinement on a remote estate if he swore never to contest her claim. Kevin, broken by his long imprisonment, muttered a hollow acceptance. She left him there, arranging for him to be transferred to a less dismal residence, ensuring that any fantasies he might harbor about reclaiming the throne remained fantasies only. Meanwhile, Bartimaeus, so recently the victorious king, found himself imprisoned in the very dungeons he had ordered refurbished when he ascended to the throne. The irony was bitter. He railed at the guards, cursing the Iron Bank as cowards and manipulators. Yet he knew this was the inevitable consequence of threatening them. A queen, presumably more compliant, had replaced him. The Iron Bank had once again foreclosed on the throne mid-conflict and placed their favor behind a rival claimant. As Elora consolidated power, the Braavosi envoys presented her with the standard forms to open a new line of credit. She already owed them for the mercenary force that helped seize the keep, plus the other costs of her coup. She signed with a steady hand, well aware that this arrangement was the only way to secure her seat. The cycle continued. The throne was no longer insolvent, yet it was bound by new obligations. The Iron Bank, for its part, had orchestrated yet another regime change without a formal war that ravaged the entire realm. It was a surgical strike this time, ensuring maximum efficiency. Observers across the world remarked, yet again, that the Iron Bank's influence was unstoppable. No matter who sits the throne, they whispered in distant courts, the Iron Bank ensures it is they who truly hold the power. In the ensuing months, Queen Elora enacted policies that balanced the kingdom's desire for relief with her Braavosi obligations. Many welcomed her as a less brutal ruler than Bartimaeus had been, and she certainly possessed a refined sense of diplomacy. The rebellious houses on the outskirts gave her cautious acceptance, seeing that she was recognized by bravos and thus likely to remain on the throne. When asked in private how she felt about her reliance on the bank, she would offer a polite smile and say that one must do what is necessary for the good of the realm. She had no illusions. The same forces that deposed Kevin and Bartimaeus could one day depose her if she dared defy them too openly or failed to keep her debts in order. In this way, the kingdom moved forward, under yet another crowned figure placed by the Iron Bank's machinations. Those who lived in the capital learned to look up at the spires of the old consulate and see the real seat of authority. Gold had changed hands, and once again, the price of the throne had been paid in coin, and in the blood of those who thought they could defy the unstoppable, implacable bank. Tales of this story spread across every port, told and retold by merchants, sailors, and minstrels. In each retelling, the moral was unmistakable. Whenever the crown's coffers run dry in the midst of war, the Iron Bank will come calling. And if the debts are not paid, the bank will foreclose upon that throne, crowning another who can meet the bill. So it had happened. So it would continue to happen, in the cyclical tapestry of a realm forever at the mercy of gold. When the final sums were counted, Generations would look back on that period as the time the Iron Bank demonstrated its might beyond all doubt. It had once been said that a king's army was supreme, or that a queen's cunning could outmaneuver any threat. But the bankers of Bravos had shown the world that gold was the apex predator in the food chain of power. A single shift in their favor and the tides of war turned. A single act of foreclosure and entire dynasties fell. Though life in the kingdom resumed its rhythm under Queen Aelora, the subtle fear of the Bravosi hand never truly left the halls of the keep. Even the new queen, who enjoyed a level of popular support, rechecked her treasury ledgers each night, mindful that a single missed payment, a single betrayal of trust, could bring a swift end to her reign, just as had befallen Kevin and Bartimaeus. In a quiet courtyard of the keep, once the site of sword training and archery drills, a patch of weeds pushed through cracked flagstones. There, in the shadows, a child might stumble upon discarded fragments of a tapestry bearing Bartimaeus's lion coin emblem or Kevin's golden stag. Their designs would be moth-eaten and torn, relics of a war-torn past that had been swept aside by the unstoppable logic of credit and debt. And if that child took these fragments to an elder, inquiring how kings could be replaced so quickly, the elder might say, "The crown is but a symbol. The gold beneath it is the bedrock of power. When that bedrock shifts, crowns topple." So it had been, and so it was, when the Iron Bank foreclosed on the crown mid-war, bankrolling a rival claimant. And in the hush of the city's nights, when the wind blew across the harbor, carrying the faint tang of salt and the clang of Bravosi masts, the people would remember. Kingdoms might rise and fall, but the Iron Bank remained, standing vigilant and unyielding, its scales balanced in the midnight blue banner, ready to tip if a monarch ever dared to default on their promise of gold. Snow settled across the streets of the capital in soft, draping silence, muting the usual clamor of horses' hooves and rolling carts. The old city, battered by war and repeated upheaval, seemed to inhale a collective breath as Queen Aelora Baratheon, her newly declared name, began her reign. Officially, her lineage combined royal blood from the Baratheon and Valerian ties to the Targaryen ancestry far back, though she was no direct daughter of Kevin. Yet the people had grown accustomed to genealogies twisted into convenient shapes, especially when Bravosi gold stood behind them. And so the realm braced itself for yet another shift at the apex of power. In the keep's torchlit corridors, the hush of the winter air collided with the hum of new governance. Guards wearing the crown's sigil patrolled carefully, but side by side with mercenaries carrying Bravosi emblems. The nighttime torches flickered along the stone walls, their orange glow dancing across the stern faces of men who knew all too well that a single misstep could throw them into the dungeons. Tension reigned behind the nominal calm. Many recalled how swiftly Bartimaeus's downfall had unfolded, and, before him, how King Kevin's star had fallen even after years of loyal service to the realm. The lesson was plain. In this city, the only constant was the Iron Bank's unwavering reach. Despite the unspoken worries, Queen Aelora's coronation was set to be grander than one might expect, given the heavy taxes and the debts overshadowing the realm. She intended to show unity, to gather the lords and ladies of the kingdom once more, hopefully in something closer to celebration than conspiratorial gloom. Preparations filled the keep for a week, artisans polishing silver servingware, palace attendants hanging fresh tapestries embroidered with the new queen's personal sigil, the crowned stag of Baratheon entwined with a braided seahorse tail, quietly acknowledging her maternal Valerian heritage. Everywhere the eye turned, servants hurried about with furs and satins, cleaning up the last traces of the tumult that had ended Bartimaeus's reign so abruptly. Yet the looming presence of the Bravosi representatives was never far from anyone's mind. Aelora herself felt the weight of it when she rose in her private chambers each morning. She had been installed swiftly, almost too easily, and she was shrewd enough to realize that any queen made by the bank could be unmade by it just as swiftly. They had nearly perfected the art of quietly foreclosing on thrones. Still, she was no mere pawn if she could help it. Her ambition was tempered by caution. This was a dance, she reminded herself, and if she performed each step with enough grace and cunning, perhaps she could navigate the path where others had stumbled and fallen. On the eve of her coronation ceremony, she took a walk through the keep's upper galleries. A small retinue of guards trailed her at a respectful distance, though she waved them back, wanting a moment of solitude with the castle's ancient stones. She paused by one of the tall, arched windows that overlooked the city. Spreading out below, the rooftops merged into a soft white blanket of snow, as if the entire capital had hidden its scars beneath that pristine cover. If only real scars could be so easily concealed. Alora's gaze drifted to the dark column of smoke rising from the chimneys of the old forging district near the docks. That was where Bravosi blacksmiths worked now, forging new currency stamps for her reign. She could not help but think of how those stamps bore the shape of her own face, and behind it, the silent but all-seeing eyes of the Iron Bank. A footstep behind her made her turn. Her new Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard approached, clearing his throat. Ser Jocelyn was a broad-shouldered, fair-haired knight from a minor house near the capital, known for his impeccable loyalty to whomever he served. He had been a supporter of Alora's cause during the coup. Still, the Queen could see in his eyes a sort of pragmatic wariness. Loyalties in this city were malleable things. "Your Grace," he said softly, bowing. "The Bravosi envoys have arrived in the courtyard. They request a private audience before tomorrow's coronation." Alora's mouth tensed slightly. "Which envoys?" Rodrigo, the principal voice of the Iron Bank here, along with two others, both appear to be new arrivals from Bravos. She let out a measured breath, gathering her composure. No doubt they wanted to confirm her readiness to formalize another arrangement. The final portion of Bartimeus's old debt remained a vexing question. Some rumored that she had inherited all of it by law. Others argued that the dethroned king should remain personally liable. The Iron Bank, Alora was certain, would present a perspective beneficial to itself. She straightened her shoulders. "I'll see them in the solar. Have the Bravosi escorted politely, but keep the guard presence visible. Let them know I appreciate their goodwill, but also that this is my keep." Ser Jocelyn bowed again, stepping back into the corridor. That evening, the meeting took place beneath the glow of tall candelabras that crackled softly. The solar's high windows looked out onto the frozen gardens, bare-limbed trees standing in shadow. Queen Alora sat in a high-backed chair, wearing a cloak of dark velvet trimmed with fur. Across from her, on cushioned seats, Rodrigo reclined with quiet confidence, flanked by two sharp-eyed Bravosi bankers introduced as Master Galdes and Mistress Jorel. Both were elegantly dressed in black and silver, the colors of the Iron Bank. A fire blazed in the hearth, lending a veneer of warmth to an otherwise frigid conversation. Rodrigo inclined his head politely. "Your Grace, we bring salutations from the Council of the Iron Bank in Bravos. They send their gratitude for the hospitality you have shown to our representatives thus far." Alora managed a small smile. "I'm pleased to hear it. I trust you found the city to your liking." His expression was carefully neutral, displaying neither acceptance nor discontent. "The city recovers from the unrest admirably. The markets hum with renewed vigor. Naturally, we hope to encourage further stability." "Stability is my aim as well," Alora replied, measuring each word. "It will take time to repair the damage inflicted first by Kevin's overspending, then by Bartimeus's abrupt changes. And now, after the coup, we must reassure the people that they have a ruler who genuinely serves them." Jorel offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We in Bravos commend your vision of service, Your Grace. Yet such noble goals often require resources. It is known the realm's treasury has seen better days. The Iron Bank stands ready to provide continued financial support." Silence hovered a moment. Alora sensed the trap. She had only recently begun to see a trickle of coin from taxes, much of which needed to pay the soldiers who had helped install her. Another large debt to Bravos would secure her immediate position but risked chaining her forever to their whims. She touched the armrest of her chair lightly, as if grounding herself. "I value your support, but the realm can ill afford new obligations. We have not even settled what remains of Bartimeus's existing debt." Rodrigo nodded almost imperceptibly. "We had hoped to speak of that. Normally, if a dethroned sovereign remains alive, the bank might seek repayment from that individual. However, in practice, the Crown's resources have always been the surety for any loan. We rarely chase private individuals. Thus, the debt, along with its interest, falls to the occupant of the throne. A flicker of annoyance lit the Queen's eyes, but she reined it in. Your point is taken, yet I recall you have Bartimaeus in your custody. Or do you? She found herself glancing between the three envoys. Rumor had it that after his capture, Bartimaeus was placed in a cell heavily guarded, though the Iron Bank likely had some say over his future. He was the signatory, was he not? Galdes cleared his throat. Indeed, Bartimaeus Lannister signed the contract. But as you know, the monarchy's continuity is considered binding by the Iron Bank. Our position is that the Crown's finances remain responsible for the obligations incurred by its recognized sovereigns. So they would hold the entire realm on the hook for Bartimaeus's debts, just as they had once tried to do for Kevin's. Alora's pulse quickened, but she forced a calm expression. And if I refuse, or if the realm truly cannot pay? A short hush. Mistress Jorel lowered her voice to a gentle hush. Your Grace, I trust we need not dwell on unfortunate precedents. The bank has always preferred negotiation over force. However, history illustrates that if a reigning monarch fails to meet obligations, the bank seeks a remedy. None wish to see a repeat of prior foreclosures. Alora exhaled, her breath tight. I do not intend to default, but I must proceed carefully. Are you suggesting the bank wants me to pay the entire sum immediately? Rodrigo folded his slender hands. We propose a structured approach. The outstanding portion is not so large as it was at the height of Bartimaeus's borrowing. We are prepared to reduce certain interest rates, contingent upon your confirmation that the Crown will uphold the full debt. In return, you will have a reasonable timeline, 3 years, let us say, to repay in full. 3 years, she echoed, weighing the possibility. It was better than an immediate sum, but still a brutal schedule. The realm was only beginning to heal. She looked each of them in the eye. Provided I agree, might I also request that you remove your private mercenary presence from the keep? My rule is best solidified by the people's trust, not the sight of foreign soldiers on every corner. Rodrigo maintained that unreadable mask. If your Grace wishes it, we can certainly begin withdrawing the Bravosi guards, once we feel the environment is secure enough to protect our consulate and our interests. Naturally, that would proceed in tandem with your faithful adherence to the repayment schedule, so their swords would remain as collateral. Alora refused to let her frustration show. Instead, she nodded with deliberate calm. Very well. I will accept the Crown's responsibility for the remainder of Bartimaeus's debt, under the terms you've described. 3 years, reduced interest, in exchange for a staged withdrawal of the bank's private guard from the capital. She paused, adding a note of steel to her voice. I want these details formalized in writing. Rodrigo offered a small bow from his seat. But of course, Your Grace, we shall have the documents prepared and delivered for your seal. We look forward to a mutually beneficial partnership. The meeting concluded soon after, leaving Alora in the quiet solar with her thoughts swirling. She felt as if she had just navigated a narrow corridor bristling with hidden blades. Her concession effectively placed the entire realm in further subservience to Bravos, yet she had seen no alternative. At least now, with these terms, she had a defined time frame. Perhaps, if the harvests improved and trade flourished, she could repay the bank sooner and free herself from its shadow. It was a faint hope, but still a hope. When the envoys departed, she remained seated by the fire, the flames casting shifting shadows along her face. She thought of Bartimaeus, rotting in a cell for making the same mistake, trying to defy the Iron Bank's demands once he was nearly out of debt. And Kevin, how many times had he tried to stall them only to be replaced by Bartimaeus? Now that cycle risked repeating with her. To break it, she needed real power, real wealth. That was no small challenge in a kingdom half-scorched by recent wars. She rose at last, summoning her steward. Send word to the Master of Coin. In the morning, I want a full account of the realm's finances, including the taxes we expect to collect from the southwestern provinces. No detail unreported. Her steward bowed and left swiftly. With a tired sigh, Elora returned to her chambers. Tomorrow's coronation would be a grand spectacle, but behind the music and bright banners, the noose of obligation to bravos would tighten. Still, she was queen, and for now that had to be enough. Morning arrived in a swirl of pageantry. Bells rang from the cathedral towers, echoing across the frosted rooftops. Columns of knights on horseback paraded through the main thoroughfares, each bearing the banner of their respective lords, newly sworn to Elora. Crowds gathered in the cold air, stomping their boots to keep warm, curious to glimpse their third monarch in only a few short years. Vendors hawked spiced wine and pastries, and children craned their necks as the queen's retinue processed slowly toward the great September for the official anointing. Inside the sept, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating a wide mosaic floor where priests in ceremonial vestments awaited. Nobles crowded the aisles, decked in their winter finery. Along the perimeter, Bravosi envoys watched with quiet composure, standing in subtle contrast to the more colorful courtiers of the realm. High above, incense drifted in hazy tendrils, adding an otherworldly feel to the scene. Elora approached the altar in a gown of shimmering gold and midnight blue, her hair braided and woven with slender ribbons. Each step felt weighted by the ghosts of those who had stood in her place. Kevin had once walked this very path to be crowned. Bartimaeus had likewise. Now the swirl of memory seemed to urge caution. She forced herself to maintain an air of regal confidence. The high septon, an elderly figure with a gentle but solemn face, performed the ancient rites. Elora knelt on a cushion of crimson velvet while he anointed her forehead with holy oils. Then, at the crescendo of the ceremony, a priest brought forth the crown. It was the same circlet Kevin had worn in his days, hammered gold, set with black onyx and pale topaz. Bartimaeus had worn it only briefly. Now it passed to her. The crown settled atop her brow, faintly cool to the touch. Applause echoed through the September, horns sounded from the choir loft. For that moment, Elora allowed herself to be simply triumphant, the occupant of the realm's highest seat. But in the crowd's hush, her gaze flicked to the Bravosi delegates near the front. Rodrigo offered a subtle dip of the head in acknowledgement. She knew that, in private, the real ceremony had already happened. The moment she accepted the new debt arrangement, everything else was mere symbolism. Still, symbolism mattered to the people. She stood and turned to face the assembled lords and ladies, raising a scepter in her right hand, letting them cheer. The sound reverberated through the high domed ceiling, and for an instant, it was possible to imagine that this realm might at last find some measure of peace. Afterward, in the great hall of the keep, a feast erupted with all the splendor that the crown's reduced coffers could muster. Musicians played lively tunes, roasted boars and geese were brought out in procession, and the tables groaned with the produce that had survived the winter storms. A few of the kingdom's major lords approached Elora to reaffirm fealty. Duke Heron of the Western Marches, Lady Isel of the stony southern coast, and even a distant cousin of House Valerion stepped forward in turn, each bending the knee. Elora greeted them graciously, promising stability and fair governance. The atmosphere was brighter than one might have expected in the wake of so many regime changes. Perhaps, the new queen mused, the realm's appetite for upheaval had finally been sated. People longed for normalcy, even if that normalcy came with Bravosi watchers still in the streets. From her seat at the head table, she looked across the hall, searching for possible new threats or alliances. Near the dais, she spotted a table of lesser nobles who had once served Kevin. They had offered her polite toasts but wore uncertain expressions, as if torn between gratitude for an end to chaos and loyalty to the old Baratheon line. Across the room sat a handful of houses that had profited under Bartimaeus, now conspicuously subdued. For the moment, they had accepted her rule, but trust was thin. She made a mental note to deal with them carefully, possibly appointing them to positions where they could do no harm. Before the feast ended, she rose to give a short address. The hall fell quiet. Torchlight flickered across tapestries bearing the new queen's crest. "My lords, my ladies," I am humbled by the faith you show in my reign. We have endured a terrible cycle of war and strife, driven by unpayable debts and conflicting claims. Today, let us make a vow. No more shall this kingdom be an easy prey to foreign gold or petty rivalries. We will stand united to protect our sovereignty and restore prosperity to our fields and harbors. I will work tirelessly to see that justice and peace prevail. Applause echoed, though some faces remained guarded. The reference to foreign gold was a delicate needle jabbed at the Bravosi. Elora could sense Rodrigo's careful eyes upon her from across the hall. Yet the queen did not shrink from the statement. If the realm was to endure, eventually it must stand on its own, free from crippling debt. She raised her goblet. To the kingdom, may it endure for all generations. The hall returned the toast. Moments later, the music resumed, and the celebrants returned to their feasting. Elora sat down, letting out a slow breath. The first steps had been taken. Now the true test lay ahead. Paying back the Iron Bank, uniting a fractured realm, and preventing any fresh claimants from disturbing her rule. At least the day had passed without incident. In the weeks after her coronation, snow continued to fall intermittently, blanketing the farmland around the capital. Elora immersed herself in the tasks of governance. She convened daily meetings with the Master of Coin, an earnest man named Lord Orwin, whose thick spectacles and ink-stained fingers testified to a lifetime spent poring over ledgers. Together, they scoured the finances for ways to economize. War taxes had drained much of the common folk's goodwill, so raising levies further was risky. The southwestern provinces, near the sea, possessed some of the richest merchant ports, but those same ports had grown used to operating semi-independently during Bartemius's short reign. Reasserting the crown's authority would demand cunning negotiation, if not the threat of armed force. Day after day, Elora found herself poring over shipping records, trade tariffs, and property rolls. Exasperation hovered at the edges of her mind. She had pictured queenship as a swirl of alliances, swords, and diplomacy, not this tedious slog through columns of figures. Yet she recognized that the realm's fate hung upon these numbers. Enough gold had to be gleaned each season to make the next scheduled payment to Bravos. If she faltered, the Iron Bank might turn to yet another claimant, or worse, they might dispatch sellswords to forcibly collect. The memory of how swiftly they had financed Bartemius's rise, and then funded her own coup, never left her. At times, she paused in her reading to wonder if Kevin or Bartemius had sat at similar desks, despairing over the same labyrinth of debts. In a sense, she pitied them, yet their mistakes were a cautionary tale. She meant to do better. Occasionally, she permitted herself a fleeting hope. If the kingdom's trade truly surged, if the harvests were bountiful, perhaps she could repay the Iron Bank ahead of schedule. Then, with the realm at peace and her monarchy secure, she could begin rolling back the bank's influence. A dream, to be sure, but still enough of one to keep her forging ahead. Amid these concerns, she also had to maintain order. Various factions eyed her warily. Some houses had lost heirs during the prior wars, others had gained new seats, and resentments simmered. In particular, House Valerian had grown fractious since its original conflict with Kevin. Part of the family had supported Elora's claim, but another branch felt she was too close to the Baratheon line. She found herself summoning old uncles and cousins, trying to placate them with trade concessions for their shipping fleets. She wanted to ensure no further insurrection flared along the coasts. Meanwhile, across the city, the Bravosi consulate bustled with quiet activity. Messengers came and went from the harbors, carrying letters sealed with the Iron Bank sigil. Although a portion of their armed men had indeed withdrawn after her coronation, many remained. They declared they were merely ensuring the safe passage of goods and collecting installments of the realm's debt. Yet rumors abounded that they also kept watch for any sign of the queen drifting from their orbit. Elora did not try to evict them entirely, not yet. The price of confrontation was too high until she had the coffers to match their muscle. One bitterly cold afternoon, Elora descended into the dungeon area of the keep, torch in hand, accompanied by 4 guards. She had decided, after much deliberation, to visit Bartimaeus. On principle, she found the man detestable, an opportunist who had nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Yet, if there was one person who could explain the labyrinthine manipulations of the Iron Bank from a ruler's perspective, it was he. Besides, she felt some responsibility having ousted him from the throne. Perhaps gleaning his mistakes would help her avoid repeating them. The guards led her down the spiral steps, the air growing damp and cold, until they reached a corridor lined with heavy iron doors. Bartimaeus's cell, while not the filthiest in the dungeon, was hardly comfortable. He was allowed a small bed of straw, a single blanket, and a chamber pot. By Alora's order, he also received daily meals of bread and broth, enough to keep him from starvation. She had no wish to make a martyr of him. As the queen approached, she saw him standing near the iron bars, eyes shadowed but alert. Even in disheveled captivity, something of his old aristocratic bearing clung to him. The set of his shoulders, the tilt of his chin, that golden hair now grown out in uneven lengths. He eyed her, then mustered a faint, mocking smile. "Your Grace," he said, bowing sardonically. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Alora raised her torch to see him more clearly. She dismissed her guards to the far end of the corridor, though they remained within earshot should trouble arise. "I wanted to see for myself how you fare," she replied, "and perhaps exchange a few words." Bartimaeus gave a short, mirthless laugh. "How I fare? I am in chains, locked away by the very woman who usurped me. And yet you ask after my welfare as if we were old friends." The queen exhaled slowly. "I never pretended to be your friend, nor do I delight in your suffering. I only want the realm stable." He studied her in the flickering light. "And do you think that chaining me up ensures stability? In my experience, a dethroned king is a rallying point for certain discontents." She inclined her head. "I considered that, but the Iron Bank stands with me, not you. And you did not exactly create a stable kingdom while you wore the crown." For a moment he did not answer. Then he moved closer to the bars, so she could see the weariness etched beneath his bravado. "I was close," he muttered. "I had nearly paid off that massive debt. I might have secured the realm's future free of Bravosi meddling if only I'd had a little more time. But you threatened them," Alora said, voice measured. "When they demanded payment, you tried to use the monarchy's authority to strong-arm the Iron Bank itself." Bartimaeus's lips twitched in a grimace. "So that's your lesson from my downfall? That I should have bowed lower to them?" He let out a sharp breath. "The bank is unstoppable, yes, but if a monarch were to gather enough gold from other sources, southern caravans, perhaps, or forging alliances in the free cities to circumvent Bravos, then that monarch might stand up to them. For a moment I thought I could accomplish that. I grew too bold, too soon." Alora stood in pensive silence. She could see how desperation had pushed him. The cyclical nature of paying off a massive debt while simultaneously trying to rule had driven him to rashness. "You nearly succeeded," she acknowledged, "but they replaced you at the first hint of defiance." His eyes glinted in the torchlight. "And they'll do the same to you in time, or to the next unlucky soul who sits on that throne. They hold the realm in their grasp." A sneer twisted his mouth. "You can't imagine how it feels to realize that no matter your armies or banners, an institution of moneylenders in a foreign city can unmake you." A slow chill crept up her spine. She forced herself not to show it. "So, if you had to do it over, what would you change?" A pause. He turned slightly as if collecting his thoughts. "I would have built alliances beyond Bravos much earlier, trading relationships with Pentos Lis Volantis. I would have sought private financiers who hate the Bravosi stranglehold and might want to invest in a rival trade network. The free cities are not all content to let Bravos reign supreme. But forging those relationships takes years. Time I didn't have, especially once the war started bleeding the realm's coffers." Alora listened, filing the idea away. "You speak of a plan. Do you truly believe the kingdom can break free? They might do to me what they did to you if I show the slightest hint of independence." He regarded her in TLY as if weighing whether to impart a final piece of counsel. "If you're truly cunning, You'll pretend docility while discreetly broadening your financial base. That's what I failed to do. Discretion. Wait until your final payment is due, then pay it off in one fell swoop, surprising them with coin gleaned from other alliances. The moment you owe them nothing, you'll be free to push them out. But don't let them see it coming. She couldn't help but let the corner of her mouth quirk in a humorless smile. You speak as though you want to help me. He shrugged, stepping back from the bars. I've nothing left to lose. Perhaps I'd enjoy the irony of watching you slip their net when I could not. But you're as likely to be undone as I was. The Iron Bank has 1,000 tentacles in every port. She met his gaze one last time. Thank you for your candor. I'll consider your words. She stepped away from the cell, gesturing for the guards to follow. A cold draft pursued her up the stairs, as though the dungeon's gloom reached out to cling to her cloak. And in her mind, she kept replaying his suggestion. Forging new alliances, securing hidden sources of gold. Was it truly possible to outmaneuver the bank? When she returned to her chambers, she found a message waiting, carried by a panting courier. The seal bore the mark of House Valerion, from the southwestern coastline. She cracked it open, scanning the lines by candlelight. The letter's tone was urgent. It spoke of new tensions in the ports, pirates hitting merchant vessels, rumors of smuggling operations on the outer islands, the local lord complaining that the crown's taxes weighed too heavily to fund sufficient ships for defense. Alora scowled. She would have to intervene or risk letting discontent fester. House Valerion's shipping lanes were critical to the realm's trade. If they felt neglected, they might once again flirt with rebellion or shift their loyalty to some other claimant. But that meant more money. Money to build war galleys, man them, patrol the seas. If the southwestern coast was vital for trade revenue, perhaps she could justify the expense. She scribbled a quick note to Lord Orwyn, instructing him to free up coin from the treasury for emergency shipbuilding, even though it would slow down the next scheduled payment to Bravos. The Queen felt her jaw tighten at the thought of the bank's reaction. They would demand their gold, but the realm's immediate security took precedence. She prayed that a few months' delay would not incite them to savage reprisals. In the days that followed, the capital bustled with the business of warship construction. New cogs and caravels were commissioned in the shipyards near the city's docks. Word was sent to House Valerion that the crown would co-fund their maritime defenses, so long as they remained loyal and shared revenue from their vast shipping operations. A measure of relief trickled through the southwestern ports. A handful of Valerion officials traveled to the capital to finalize the arrangements. Alora met them personally, promising that as soon as the ships were outfitted, the crown's banners would patrol the sea lanes. It was a delicate juggling act. Alora sent the Iron Bank a courteous letter explaining that unforeseen maritime threats required immediate expenditure, so the next interest payment would be modest, with the remainder postponed until autumn. She underscored her commitment to settling the debt in full. The reply from Bravos arrived swiftly, a polite but coolly insistent reminder that the bank's patience was not limitless. Reading it, Alora imagined the stony expressions of Rodrigo and his associates, poised to pounce if they sensed a repeat of Bartimeus's gambit. The Queen drafted a reply that sought to soothe them, detailing how the improved trade routes would ultimately yield greater tax revenue. She carefully avoided any sign of defiance. On the surface, at least, she maintained the posture of a cooperative debtor. Yet beneath that outward compliance, Alora began to implement a subtle strategy. Drawing upon Bartimeus's advice, she reached out to discreet envoys from a few of the other free cities, Pentos, Mir, even Lys. She couched her letters in the language of cultural exchange and expanded trade. If she could establish alternative financial ties, perhaps she could secure a line of credit that would not funnel directly back to Bravos. She knew it was risky. The Bravosi had spies in every major port. But if she did nothing, she would remain perpetually at their mercy. So she took the calculated risk of sending forth these overtures, ensuring each message was entrusted to a carefully chosen courier or hidden within shipments leaving the southwestern harbors. Weeks passed, and winter gradually loosened its grip. The snowmelt in the capital streets gave way to muddy rivulets. The new war galleys took shape in the dockyards. At first, progress was slow, hampered by lack of skilled shipwrights and the chill weather. But as the days lengthened, more craftsmen arrived, drawn by the promise of the crown's silver. Soon, the sound of saws and hammers rang out along the waterfront from dawn until dusk. The Queen herself visited the docks to inspect the progress, accompanied by Lord Orwyn, who wore an anxious expression each time he saw the treasury's silver exchanging hands. She would take a moment to greet the shipwrights, offering kind words, promising them the crown's gratitude. Elora found that a personal touch helped morale. The realm had gone so long under the gloom of war and debt that even small gestures counted. One late afternoon, as she stood near the half-finished prow of a galley, she noticed a Bravosi agent in the crowd. He stood off to the side, wearing a plain cloak, but his bearing was too still, too watchful. When she caught his eye, he did not look away. A faint chill ran through her. The bank was clearly keeping track of how much she invested in these ships instead of paying them. She kept her expression neutral and continued her inspection without acknowledging him. That evening, she wrote a stern note to her Master of Whispers, instructing him to discreetly identify all foreign spies in the dockyards and ensure none gained access to sensitive information. She did not want news of her budding alliances with other cities leaking prematurely. A few more weeks slid by. Then a welcome surprise arrived in the form of an envoy from Pentos, a sea captain named Hans, who claimed to represent a wealthy consortium of Pentoshi merchants seeking new trade routes in Westeros. Elora granted him an audience in her private receiving chamber, away from Bravosi eyes. The man was wiry, with a quick, intelligent face and a neat black beard. He bowed low. "Your Grace," Hans began, "my patrons in Pentos have observed the realm's recent turmoil with interest. Now that you are restoring order, they see potential for profitable ventures, especially if the crown is willing to offer favorable trade terms." Elora raised an eyebrow. "By favorable terms, you mean lowered tariffs in southwestern ports, I assume. Perhaps exclusive docking rights for your ships." Hans inclined his head. "Precisely. Our consortium can transport goods that Bravosi merchants often overlook. Spices, wines from further east, certain exotic textiles. We seek a direct arrangement with your crown, bypassing Bravos's usual channels." She could barely conceal her intrigue. This might be the wedge she needed to reduce the realm's dependence on Bravosi trade. But she also had to gauge the risk. "And in return, your patrons would provide?" Hans smiled cannily. "We can offer immediate coin in exchange for guaranteed privileges, an upfront investment, if you will. Should you require a loan to refurbish your fleets or strengthen your roads, my patrons would happily negotiate terms." Terms. The Queen couldn't help a bitter laugh inwardly. Another set of financiers offering credit, as if stepping from the shadows. But that was precisely what Bartimaeus had hinted at, diversifying her sources of capital. If she accepted Pentoshi gold, she could accelerate paying down Bravos, or she could fund the realm's projects more robustly while meeting her installments. The key was to avoid falling into the same trap, owing too much to any one city. She leaned forward on her seat, the candlelight casting shadows across her face. "I'm willing to discuss such an agreement, but know that any pact that draws the ire of Bravos must be handled delicately. They have a vested interest in maintaining their trade dominance here." Hans's eyes gleamed. "We are prepared for subtlety. We have our own ships, our own networks of warehouses. Much can be done under the guise of typical commerce, far from Bravosi scrutiny. We would require your protection, of course, should Bravos attempt sabotage." A frown tugged at her mouth. Was she ready to risk open antagonism with the Iron Bank to secure Pentoshi support? Not yet, but a quiet arrangement might be feasible. "We'll proceed cautiously," she said. "Let us begin with a smaller agreement, reduce tariffs for certain goods in southwestern ports. In exchange, you will provide an upfront sum to my treasury, half in gold coin, half in silver trade bars. If that goes well, we can deepen our arrangement. That way, each of us can test the waters." Hans agreed with an enthusiastic bow. They spent the next hours discussing details, scribbling notes, and drafting a preliminary contract. By the time the envoy left the keep under cover of dusk, Elora felt both exhilarated and uneasy. If the Bravosi discovered what she was doing, they might interpret it as a direct challenge. But if she could maintain secrecy long enough to gather enough funds, she might repay the Iron Bank fully, perhaps even sooner than the 3-year deadline. Then she would no longer be at their mercy. However, forging a side alliance did not magically solve her problems. She still had a realm to run, rebellious lords to keep in line, and various intrigues swirling around the capital. Tension lingered among the nobility. The southwestern coast had stabilized for now, but rumor had it a cluster of Kevin loyalists was stirring near the northern border, resentful that the rightful Baratheon line was supplanted by a mere distant cousin. Could they cause real trouble? Possibly, if a charismatic leader emerged to rally them. And so, Elora kept her master of whispers busy, rooting out any plot that might flare into open rebellion. Thus far, Kevin himself remained a pitiful figure, quietly exiled to a small manor under guard, where he lived out a sullen, powerless existence. She visited him only once, found him sunk in bitterness, and left feeling grimly certain he posed no immediate threat, unless someone freed him and used him as a figurehead. Summer approached, banishing the last traces of winter from the fields. Caravans carrying the season's produce began arriving at the capital, fueling optimism in the markets. The southwestern merchant lanes grew active. Elora insisted on personally presiding over trade negotiations with the lords of the region, ensuring that the crown took its fair share of tariffs. Bit by bit, coin trickled into the treasury. Meanwhile, shipments of Pentoshi silver bars arrived in discrete intervals, carefully recorded in a hidden ledger that only she, Lord Orwyn, and a handful of trusted accountants knew about. These bars were quietly moved to a secure vault in the keep's lower levels, one that was not part of the official treasury. Elora intended to use them as her secret weapon, a lump sum that might, at the right moment, pay off the Iron Bank in full, or at least serve as a cushion against crisis. The Bravosi envoys remained watchful, noticing the realm's cautious upswing in trade. On the surface, they seemed pleased that the crown might meet its debt obligations more reliably. However, Mistress Jorel occasionally dropped by the royal court, asking subtle questions about the source of new revenues. Elora always responded with the same litany: increased port traffic, better harvest yields, new efficiency in tax collection. None of it was a lie, just not the entire truth. As the summer weeks turned to months, the new war galleys that Elora had ordered were finally completed. They sailed out from the capital's docks, their prows freshly painted with the crown's sigil, crews of determined sailors under the command of loyal captains. Reports soon came back that pirate raids in the southwestern lanes had diminished significantly. House Valerion wrote with guarded praise, complimenting the Queen's commitment to the coasts. Commerce increased yet again, funneling more taxes into the realm's coffers. Yet prosperity always invited new complications. Some lesser lords grew ambitious, clamoring for a share of the heightened trade wealth, demanding privileges or reduced taxes. Tension crackled at every major council session, with certain nobles claiming the crown was hoarding coin. Elora walked a tightrope between placating them and retaining enough funds to keep her secret plan viable. She had to maintain illusions of a nearly empty treasury so the Iron Bank wouldn't suspect her building a hidden reservoir of silver. Matters came to a head one scorching afternoon in a council meeting held in the Great Hall. Lord Teverick, a blustering baron from the inland plains, challenged her to prove that the realm's new tax windfalls were truly being spent for the common good. "Your Grace," he declared in a voice that rang off the stone walls, "my people labor in the fields under the sweltering sun, yet they see no relief from the crown's demands. Rumors abound that you are stockpiling gold for your personal ends. We require transparency, or you risk losing the trust of the landholders." Elora fixed him with a calm stare. "You speak as though the realm's roads and bridges repair themselves. We have spent coin to rebuild from years of war, to fund the new warships that protect our shores, to ensure safer trade routes. All of this benefits you and every subject who relies on stable commerce." A ripple of assent went through some of the lords, but others seemed inclined to side with Teverick. Sensing that she could not simply dismiss the matter, the Queen nodded to Lord Orwyn, who stood behind her with his ever-present ledger. At her cue, he stepped forward and recited a litany of expenditures. New roads, fortress repairs, shipbuilding costs, garrisons along the border. By the time he finished, Tevrik wore an uncertain look, uncertain whether to persist or relent. "Even so," the Baron said, voice lower now, "we are pressed hard. If the Crown's finances are indeed so burdened, perhaps we should consider lowering interest payments to the Iron Bank. They have drained us enough. Let them wait." A sharp intake of breath spread through the gathered courtiers. Suggesting a default or delay to Braavos was a dangerous notion. Alora leveled a cold stare at him. "The Iron Bank does not wait kindly, my lord. As we have all seen, they will find another monarch if they suspect we mean to cheat them. What you propose would be suicidal for the realm." Tevrik opened his mouth to argue, but the Queen raised a commanding hand, silencing him. "We will meet our obligations to Braavos on schedule, and I assure you, any surplus is reinvested into the kingdom's welfare. The moment we are free of Braavosi debts, all taxes can be relaxed. Until then, we stand firm. Is that clear?" He pressed his lips together, then nodded sullenly, bowing. A wave of subdued agreement followed from the other lords. The Queen met their stares one by one, letting them see the steel in her eyes. Slowly, the tension receded. Business moved on to other matters. Yet behind her measured words, Alora felt her heart pounding. Tevrik's outburst was a reminder of how precarious her position remained. A single foolish move or a wave of popular frustration could topple everything she had built. That evening, she convened a smaller, secret meeting in her private solar, inviting only Lord Orwyn, the Master of Whispers, and Ser Jossen, the Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard. Candlelight glimmered off the polished wood table as she explained her mounting concerns. "We must keep a tight lid on any rumor that the treasury is not empty," she said quietly. "If the Braavosi suspect I'm hoarding silver or forging new alliances, they may move to replace me. And if the noble houses suspect the same, they might demand a portion of it or stir up resentment. We walk a knife's edge." Lord Orwyn nervously adjusted his spectacles. "Your Grace, the hidden vault is filling, albeit slowly. At this rate, you could potentially pay off the entire debt in a year, maybe a year and a half, if you keep funneling the Pentoshi silver and southwestern taxes there. But as it grows, the risk of discovery increases." The Master of Whispers, a slender man named Karen, leaned forward. "I've attempted to keep Braavosi spies from learning too much, but they are cunning. Sooner or later, one slip could betray our secret. Are you sure we shouldn't accelerate the plan and pay them off in a sudden stroke?" Alora considered it, her fingers drumming the table. "We're not ready. If I approach them with a lump sum now, they'll ask where it came from, and we lack the full amount. Also, we must have enough in reserve afterward to defend ourselves in case they decide to retaliate. If we show them we have independent means, they might see us as a threat." Ser Jossen, arms crossed over his broad chest, spoke softly. "Your Grace, you know I stand by you in all things, but in truth, how can we keep the Braavosi from controlling us even after the debt is paid? If they can finance armies for any rival, how do we ensure they don't do so again, once we no longer owe them coin?" The Queen's gaze dropped to the flickering candle flame. It was the central dilemma. Once we repay them, we must solidify enough alliances, both in and out of Westeros, to discourage any foreign-funded coup. If we become wealthy enough, if the lords are satisfied, and if we have external partners, Braavos will think twice before toppling us again. They do what they do because it's profitable. If a coup seems too costly or uncertain, they might prefer to keep collecting interest through normal trade rather than wage a proxy war. She lifted her gaze. "I will not pretend it's easy. We must walk softly and carry a very big stick, as the saying goes." The Queen shifted her attention to each man in turn. "Karen, I want you to strengthen intelligence networks in Mir, Lys, and Pentos. Let me know if Braavos tries to bribe them into isolating us. Ser Jossen, ensure the new war galleys remain loyal. If Braavosi sells words or mercenary fleets appear, we'll need every advantage. Lord Orwyn, keep funneling half of our southwestern revenues into the hidden vault. The other half we'll use for public improvements to keep the lords pacified." "Understood." Each man nodded in solemn agreement. So the meeting adjourned, leaving Elora to brood on the precarious balancing act that would define her reign. She could hardly sleep that night. Visions of Kevin's downfall, Bartimaeus's dethronement, all flickered in her mind. The Iron Bank was a silent, watchful colossus. She prayed that her caution and cunning might prove sufficient to avoid joining the list of monarchs tossed aside like worn coins. Summer gave way to autumn, the leaves turning gold and crimson along the city's avenues. Merchant ships from Pentos arrived more frequently now, bringing goods to the southwestern ports. Trade blossomed, profits soared, and House Valerion, once on the brink of rebellion, found itself well compensated for its maritime cooperation. The realm enjoyed a rare moment of relative peace, with the new war galleys chasing off the last of the pirates. Harvests in the northern farmland were moderate, if not bountiful, so food shortages were kept at bay. The people, tired of constant conflict, let out a collective sigh of relief. Meanwhile, the Bravosi consulate kept a close eye on the realm's finances. They pressed for on-time payments, and indeed, Elora never failed to send them. Month after month, portions of gold, silver, and other valuables were shipped to Bravos, diminishing the official treasury but never depleting it entirely. Still, each time, the Queen dreaded that the bank might suspect her hidden stash. Yet their envoys remained cordial, even occasionally congratulatory, perhaps believing that the Queen was simply an efficient manager of the realm's resources. A turning point arrived in late autumn, when Elora judged her secret vault large enough to pay off the entire remainder of the bank's debt if necessary, plus a surplus for emergencies. She summoned her inner circle once more to discuss the exact timing of the final stroke. Lord Orwyn's calculations suggested that, by the end of winter, the hidden vault would be more than sufficient to cover all obligations with a comfortable margin. On top of that, new shipments of Pentoshi silver were due to arrive in early spring, further bolstering the reserve. Yet Ser Jocelyn urged prudence. "Your Grace, if we reveal ourselves too soon, Bravos may interpret this as a threat. If we allow them to guess that you've been amassing alternative finances, they might undermine you before you even deliver the final payment. Perhaps we should wait, continuing as we are, until we are absolutely certain they can do nothing to us." The Queen carefully weighed his warning. Bartimaeus's abrupt confrontation with Bravos had spelled his ruin. She remembered his parting advice, to strike at the precise moment when they least expected it. "We will wait until the depth of winter," she decided. "When the seas are rough and it is harder for Bravos to mobilize a fleet quickly. If they do try to raise an army or ship mercenaries across, the storms will slow them. We'll finalize everything in that narrow window. Once we are free of the debt, it will be too late for them to orchestrate a swift coup before spring. By then, we can fortify our position." Her council agreed, and so they continued the ruse. Winter arrived with fierce winds and freezing rain that coated the capital's rooftops in slick ice. The southwestern lanes, typically warmer, still saw storms churn the seas. Ship travel became more hazardous, limiting how quickly Bravosi or Pentoshi vessels could ply the waves. Perfect cover for the Queen's plan. On a bitterly cold morning, as hail battered the keep's ramparts, Elora quietly ordered her steward to open the secret vault. Chests of silver bars and gold coins were carried up in the pre-dawn gloom by trusted guards. The operation was performed in utmost secrecy. By midday, a caravan of 6 heavily guarded wagons stood assembled in the courtyard. Each wagon bore the royal crest. Each was laden with carefully inventoried treasure, enough to settle the realm's entire remaining debt to the Iron Bank, with a portion left in the official treasury for plausible deniability. Accompanying them would be a retinue of the Queen's most loyal knights, armed to the teeth, ensuring no one interfered on the short journey from the keep to the Bravosi consulate a mile away. The plan was simple. Deliver the treasure to the bank's local representatives, obtain a formal receipt that declared the Crown's obligations settled, and make certain it was recognized by Bravos' highest authorities. Once the realm was free of the loan, Elora intended to politely but firmly demand that any Bravosi soldiers still in the city vacate their posts. She would offer to continue normal trade, but as an equal partner, no longer a debtor subject to intimidation. Before the caravan departed, Elora stood in the cobblestone courtyard, breath fogging in the chilly air, her cloak pulled tight. She inspected the wagons, checking to see that each was secured. Lord Orwin clutched his ledger with trembling hands, verifying the sums. Ser Jossen's knights sat atop their horses, scanning the nearby roofs for threats. The Queen's heartbeat pounded with anticipation. Was this the final act of defiance that might spark a new crisis, or would it be the triumphant moment where the realm cast off the Iron Bank's yoke? "Move out," she commanded. The caravan rumbled forward through the courtyard gates, rolling carefully along the icy streets. Citizens watched curiously from windows and doorways as the wagons creaked by. None knew the cargo's true significance, only that a conspicuous show of force accompanied it. When they reached the Bravosi consulate, a stately building near the harbor, its walls emblazoned with the iron scales, Rodrigo and Mistress Jorel were waiting in the portico, evidently forewarned by the royal dispatch Elora had sent that morning. Rodrigo's calm, measured expression flickered just a fraction when he glimpsed the quantity of treasure being offloaded. He cast a swift glance at Mistress Jorel. Then, bowing politely to the Queen, he said, "Your Grace, I must confess, we did not expect such a large transfer today." Elora dismounted, handing her reins to a knight. "These sums constitute the full repayment of the Crown's remaining debt to the Iron Bank, including accrued interest. I trust you have your records in order to confirm." Mistress Jorel's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained cordial. "Indeed, we shall need to count and verify. Will you wait while we do so?" The Queen nodded. "I will. And when you are done, I expect formal documents releasing the Crown from all obligation, signed and sealed by your bank's authority." Rodrigo gestured for Bravosi accountants to step forward. They began the laborious task of unloading chests, weighing coins, checking stamps on silver bars. A pair of scribes recorded each item meticulously. A hush descended over the consulate courtyard, broken only by the jingle of coins and the scratch of quills. Elora waited, trying not to let her impatience show. She had dreaded this moment for so long. Now it was here, and she could practically taste the tension in the air. After hours of methodical counting, the Bravosi accountants conferred in low voices with Rodrigo and Mistress Jorel. Finally, Rodrigo approached the Queen, bowing. "Your Grace, it appears everything is in order. The total indeed matches and exceeds the required sum for full repayment." Mistress Jorel added, "We will transmit immediate notice to the Iron Bank's main offices in Bravos. Here, in the meantime, are provisional documents acknowledging the settlement." She handed over a scroll, stamped with the Bravosi seal. "A final confirmation, bearing the full council's approval, will follow by ship in due course." A wave of relief threatened to buckle Elora's knees. She kept her composure, though her breath came slightly unsteady. "I will await that final confirmation eagerly. Meanwhile, since the Crown's debt is now satisfied, I trust there will be no further cause for Bravosi soldiers to remain in or around the capital." Rodrigo's expression betrayed the faintest hint of unease. "Of course, we shall recall our guards once the council in Bravos confirms this settlement. We ask for patience, Your Grace. Winter seas can be treacherous. A message to Bravos and back might take weeks." Elora inclined her head, showing no outward frustration. "I understand, but let us be clear. I expect them gone as soon as is practicable. The kingdom can manage its own defense now." Rodrigo bowed again, conceding the point. Naturally, as the Bravosi accountants moved to secure the newly received treasure, the Queen turned on her heel, mounted her horse, and signaled her retinue to depart. Though she rode away with regal bearing, inside she felt an almost heady elation, tinged with foreboding. She had done it. The realm was free of the bank's official debt. Of course, that did not mean the Iron Bank could not raise trouble in the future, but at least the most immediate chain around her neck was gone. Upon returning to the keep, she summoned her inner circle for a celebratory drink. Lord Orwin, eyes shining, toasted the queen. Your grace, you have accomplished what neither Kevin nor Bartimaeus could, repaying the Iron Bank in full. Alora raised her goblet of mulled wine but kept her tone measured. Let us not celebrate too soon. The final seal from Bravos has yet to arrive. And once they know I've found alternative means of finance, they might view me as a rival or threat. We must stay vigilant. Still, the mood in the council chamber was buoyant. News spread among the keep's servants, and soon the city heard rumors that the crown had discharged its debt. Uncertainty mingled with excitement. Some feared a Bravosi reprisal. Others rejoiced that the realm might see lower taxes or an end to foreign meddling. For her part, Alora prepared for possible backlash. She quietly ordered more knights to the southwestern ports, ensuring the war galleys remained active. If Bravos tried to sponsor a rebellion or land mercenaries, the crown's forces would be ready. Days passed. The wind howled outside the walls, and the capital huddled under winter's harsh blanket. Tension hovered in the air like a coiled serpent. The Bravosi consulate shut its gates, claiming it was busy reorganizing. A few armed foreigners discreetly left the city, presumably heading back to Essos. Others, however, remained. The queen waited, each day checking with her master of whispers for news of the official letter from Bravos. Then, one late afternoon, a courier bearing the Iron Bank's crest arrived through the north gate. He was half frozen from the journey, carrying a sealed dispatch. The queen was in the middle of a meeting with Lady Isel and other southwestern representatives when she heard the announcement. She excused herself and hurried to the keep's front hall, cloak sweeping behind her. The courier bowed low, handing over a small chest containing multiple documents. With careful haste, she broke the seal on the largest scroll and read, "To Her Grace, Alora of the Crown of Westeros, the Council of the Iron Bank does hereby acknowledge receipt in full of all sums owed under the obligations incurred by Bartimaeus Lannister, recognized once as king. Having verified the accounts, we declare said obligations fulfilled, with no outstanding balance. We extend our courtesy and look forward to future cooperation in trade and finance. Our envoys in your capital are instructed to conclude any formalities and to respect the sovereignty of your crown, so long as all parties remain in good standing. Signed, the Council of the Iron Bank of Bravos." A sudden, quiet relief coursed through her. She read it twice to ensure she hadn't misunderstood. The queen showed the scroll to Lord Orwin, who peered over it, nodding vigorously. "It's official, Your Grace," he murmured. "We are free." She looked at the second document, which was a more detailed contract release. Then the third, which was a formal invitation to maintain cordial relations and ongoing trade partnerships with Bravos. The language was politely distant, but it signaled that the Iron Bank saw no immediate profit in waging war on her. If anything, they might prefer to keep a friendly, if not subservient, monarchy in Westeros. Alora's eyes closed for a moment. She clasped the chest to her chest, letting out a long breath. It was done. Decades of debt that had toppled two kings were finally erased. A wave of applause rippled from the small gathering of her guards and staff. She raised her head, smiling. "Spread word to the city. The crown stands free of all Bravosi debt." Cheers broke out in the hall. The queen's heart soared, even as she reminded herself that this was just the beginning of the next challenge. Holding her throne without the bank's noose, but also without inadvertently provoking them into financing another coup. That evening, the city lit torches in the streets, an impromptu festival vibe taking hold. Revelers drank to the realm's independence, though many only half understood what it meant. Minstrels composed new ballads about the queen who paid the piper in full. Even some Bravosi soldiers who had not yet departed wandered the streets with uncertain smiles, knowing their presence was suddenly less powerful. Everything seemed strangely lighter. Alora spent that night in her private chambers, going through the day's messages with a sense of renewed purpose. Yes, the Iron Bank might remain a force in the world, and yes, they might still try to manipulate events. But at least for now, they had no direct claim on her kingdom's coffers. She could rule without an immediate threat of foreclosure. Still, she found herself pondering the next steps. Could she reduce taxes to appease the barons who had grown restless? Should she invest in roads, farmland, or new alliances overseas? The realm's future, once overshadowed by endless debt, now opened into possibility. She felt excitement swirl in her chest. But caution, too. As soon as the Bravosi discovered she had used an alternate source of financing, pentos, lists, or otherwise, they might label her a cunning trickster. Or perhaps they already knew. The coming months would reveal how far their tolerance stretched. In the following weeks, the Queen formally thanked the Bravosi consulate for its cooperation, then presented them with a polite request to withdraw the last of their guards. Rodrigo, once so confident, smiled thinly and said they would comply. Quietly, a few Bravosi warships slipped out of harbor. Elora suspected the Iron Bank's web of spies remained behind, but at least their open military presence was gone. That alone allowed the realm to breathe easier. At the same time, the Queen used the moment of triumph to address her nobility. She announced a modest reduction in certain taxes, praising the lords who had contributed to the realm's recovery. This won her good favor among the barons, who had grown weary of constant levies. She made a show of distributing new grants for agricultural development, repairing minor roads, and funding local watchtowers. The southwestern lords, especially House Valerion, were pleased that more coin was being spent internally rather than shipped off to Bravos. Gradually, trust in Elora's reign solidified. However, the specter of the Iron Bank was not so easily dispelled. Reports trickled in from the free cities that Bravos was forging new alliances, possibly to undercut Pentos's trade with Westeros. Some rumored that large sums of Bravosi gold had moved through Volantis, as if the bank were preparing for an investment or a new enterprise. Elora's Master of Whispers speculated that they might be positioning themselves to pressure the kingdom indirectly, perhaps by making deals with other powers or by raising a formidable mercenary force. But no direct threats materialized, at least not yet. As winter began to wane, the Queen ventured out for a ceremonial ride through the capital, accompanied by Ser Jossen and a small retinue. Citizens lined the streets, some tossing flower petals despite the lingering chill. Elora wore a simple cloak, wanting to display accessibility rather than pomp. She saw real hope in the people's faces for the first time in many seasons. Children ran alongside, cheering. Old folk bowed their heads in respect. Merchants shouted praises from their stalls. She recognized how swiftly sentiment could change, but for this moment, she allowed herself to bask in it. That night, she held a small banquet for her closest allies, raising a toast to a realm no longer burdened by foreign debt. She had Kevin's rightful name, she had the crown Bartimaeus had stolen, and she had achieved what neither man could, beating the Iron Bank at its own game, or at least surviving it. Somewhere in the dungeons, Bartimaeus might be cursing her success. Somewhere in his distant manor, Kevin might envy her hold on the throne. Yet they had both been undone by the same monstrous apparatus of finance that she now seemed to have cast off. Yet in her heart, Elora understood this victory was fragile. The Iron Bank would always remain a power. Should she falter, should a harvest fail or a new war erupt, she might need more gold than the realm could muster. And then the cycle might begin again. This was the precarious reality of a kingdom perched among larger forces. But for now, she had seized a measure of autonomy, an interlude of freedom, and she intended to use every day of it to fortify her rule, strengthen her alliances, and ensure that the next time Bravos looked across the sea with hungry eyes, they would think twice before trying to unseat the Queen who had repaid every last coin. Time would tell if she could truly break the chain that had ensnared Kevin and Bartimaeus. But as she stood on the keep's highest parapet at dawn, gazing over a city stirring with renewed life, she felt, for once, like the realm's destiny was its own. Perhaps that was all any monarch could hope for. A chance to shape their fate, unbound by debts they never asked for. She breathed in the cold morning air and whispered a silent promise, to herself, to the people, to the uncertain future. No more foreclosures, no more puppet thrones. The crown would stand on its own, come what may. And if the Iron Bank decided otherwise, they would find that the once hapless kingdom had learned a thing or two about playing the grand game of gold and power.